You type a surname into an archive search box. The results load slowly. There are hundreds of entries. You expected perhaps a few. You scroll. Your grandfather's name appears. Then again on a different kind of document entirely. Not a census record, not a land registry, a deportation order. Signed. That is where several people have found themselves in the last 30 years. Not in a Hollywood moment. In a quiet room in front of a screen or a microphone, holding a piece of paper they cannot put back. This episode is about what comes after that moment. What you do with a name that carries a record you did not make. There is a question at the center of all of this, and it is not about guilt in the legal sense. The question is simpler and harder than that. If you carry a surname that appears in archives as the name of someone who caused serious harm, what do you owe the people who were harmed? What do you owe yourself? And what does it mean to keep the name, or to change it, or to speak about it publicly when the rest of your family has chosen silence for 60 years? We are going to follow that question through real cases, real documents, and real decisions. We are going to be careful with what we know and honest about what remains uncertain. Let us start with the context you need to understand why this matters as much as it does. When the Second World War ended in 1945, millions of people across Europe who had held positions inside the Nazi state, the SS, the police battalions, the civil administration, the courts, the camps, simply went home. Some were tried. The Nuremberg proceedings, the subsequent Nuremberg trials, the later trials in Poland, France, Israel, and West Germany held some of them to account. But the majority were not tried. Many were quietly reintegrated. Some were given back their pensions. Some went into business. Some became teachers, doctors, civil servants. Some raised families. They had children. Those children had children. Those grandchildren are alive today. The German population alone in 1945 was roughly 66 million. Historians who have studied post-war German society estimate that a very large proportion of those families had at least one member who had participated in some capacity in the apparatus of the Nazi state. That does not make all of them war criminals. The range of involvement stretched from signing a document that facilitated harm to commanding operations that killed thousands. But it does mean that the aftermath of those years did not stay in the courts. It came home. It sat at the dinner table. It was passed, in silence or in distortion, to the next generation. What the children and grandchildren inherited was not always knowledge. Often it was the opposite. They inherited a gap where the truth should have been. Nicholas Frank was born in 1939. His father was Hans Frank, who served as the Nazi administrator of occupied Poland during the war. Hans Frank was tried at Nuremberg. He was convicted. He was executed in 1946. Nicholas Frank was 7 years old when his father died. He grew up with a version of his father that was shaped by his mother and by the post-war silence that settled over many German households in the 1950s. The version was sanitized, heroic, in a private family sense. The crimes were not discussed at the table. As an adult, Nicholas Frank became a journalist. He spent decades researching his father through documents. He read the trial records. He read the administrative files from the general government in Poland. He read his father's diaries. What he found was not ambiguous. Hans Frank had presided over a territory in which millions of people were killed. He had known what was happening. He had at various points actively participated in decisions that led to mass death. Nicholas Frank wrote about his father in a book. He did not write with pity. He wrote with what he described as deliberate, chosen anger. He argued that Germans of his generation and younger generations had an obligation not to look away from what their parents and grandparents had done. He argued that the softening of family memory, the gradual transformation of perpetrators into victims of circumstance or victims of ideology they could not resist, was itself a form of harm done to the people who were actually killed. He kept his surname. That choice meant something. It meant he would be identified everywhere, in every interview, in every review of his book, as the son of Hans Frank. He used that identification. He turned the weight of the name into the platform for the testimony. Not everyone has made that choice. and the frank case should not be held up as the only morally acceptable response. The situations people find themselves in are not identical. Consider what it means to discover a family history not as an adult with professional resources and a public platform, but as a child in a German or Austrian school in the 1960s or 1970s. The Federal Republic of Germany had, by the 1960s, begun to introduce curriculum that addressed the crimes of the Nazi period more directly than the immediate post-war years had managed. For children who had perpetrators in their immediate family, that classroom education could become something unbearable. Several accounts collected by historians studying what is sometimes called the second generation in Germany describe the experience of sitting in a classroom learning about camp administration or deportation policies, and recognizing a role or a title or a geographic location that matched something half heard at home. The knowledge arrived in public before it was processed in private. Some of those children went home and asked questions. Some of those questions were met with silence, deflection, or anger. Some of those children did not ask again. The silence did not erase the knowledge. It drove it inward. And it created what several researchers who have worked with these families describe as a kind of inherited tension. A shame that had no proper object because it was never named. A loyalty that had no proper basis because it was never examined. Beate and Serge Klaasfeld are not themselves descendants of perpetrators, but their decades of work-hunting war criminals who had been allowed to live quietly under their own names, or under changed names, produced a secondary record that matters here. Each time they identified and exposed a former SS officer or Gestapo officer living under a comfortable post-war life, there was a family. There were children and grandchildren who had been told something that was not true, or had been told nothing at all. The exposure did not only happen to the man in question, it happened to the whole family structure built around the silence. There is documented testimony from adult children of men exposed through this kind of investigative work describing the experience as a kind of delayed explosion. The structure they had grown up inside simply was not the structure they had believed it to be. The man who had been a loving grandfather had also been something else entirely, on specific documented dates, in specific documented places. That is the architecture of the problem. The name is the same. The person holding it is innocent of what was done under it, but the record is attached. And the people who were harmed, or their descendants, know the name too. The German government established several mechanisms over the post-war decades to address questions of accountability and memory. The Central Office of the State Justice Administrations for the Investigation of National Socialist Crimes, based in Ludwigsburg, was founded in 1958 and has continued its work into the present century. Archives in Germany, Poland, the Czech Republic, Israel, and elsewhere hold documents that bear names. Those archives have become, especially since digitization expanded access, places where descendants encounter their own family histories in ways they did not anticipate. Genealogy is now a mass hobby. Platforms that help people trace family trees have become enormously popular across the English-speaking world and across Europe. For most people, the results are interesting but emotionally mild. For a smaller number, the trail leads somewhere that requires a decision. Do you tell other family members what you found? Do you contact institutions? Do you contact survivor organizations? Do you speak publicly? Do you change your name? If you value calm, document-led history that follows the evidence wherever it leads, subscribe to the Descendants file. New files go up regularly. There is always another name in the archive. The people who have spoken publicly about these discoveries are not a uniform group. They differ in what they found, in what their families had told them, and in what they chose to do afterward. But several common threads appear in their accounts. One is the experience of the archive itself as something close to a physical confrontation. A document is not an abstraction. It has a date, a signature, an instruction. When that signature matches a name you grew up with, the document stops being history and becomes something else. Several people have described this as the moment when a private family story and a public historical record simply could not be held separately anymore. Another common thread is the family system that surrounds the discovery. In many cases, an older relative already knew or knew more than they had said. In some cases, siblings respond differently to the same information, one wanting to speak, another wanting to protect a parent or grandparent from public exposure. These disagreements are not resolved quickly. Some have lasted decades, some have ended families as functional units. A third thread is the question of what speaking publicly actually accomplishes. The argument for speaking is that silence continues to harm. It harms the descendants of victims who deserve acknowledgement. It harms the speaker's own integrity, and it harms the wider public understanding of how ordinary institutions and ordinary people participated in organized harm. The argument against speaking, as some family members of perpetrators have expressed it, is that the person who did the harm is dead and cannot be punished further. That public exposure serves more to satisfy outside demand than to repair anything, and that the living children and grandchildren who took no part in anything should not be permanently defined by association. This argument deserves to be taken seriously and examined honestly. It is not simply denial or cowardice. There are people who have processed family history privately, contributed to memorial funds, spoken to researchers in confidence, and chosen not to make their family name into a public exhibit. That choice is not automatically the wrong one. What becomes harder to defend is the choice that refuses to engage with the record at all. The family that insists, in the face of documented evidence, that grandfather was simply a soldier following orders, or that the records are exaggerated, or that someone else is responsible, is making a choice too. And the cost of that choice is borne primarily by the people who were harmed, and by anyone in a younger generation of that family who later discovers what was actually done, and has to carry not only the original record, but also the added weight of knowing the family chose to obscure it. The name is not the crime. Nobody has argued otherwise seriously. A daughter is not responsible for her father's decisions. A grandson cannot be punished for a grandfather's crimes. The legal position is clear, and the moral position regarding legal liability follows it. But there is a difference between legal innocence and historical relationship. A name connects you to a record. What you do with that connection, whether you examine it honestly, whether you acknowledge it to people who were harmed, whether you allow it to inform how you understand the broader history, those are choices that are yours to make. And they have weight. The children who inherited the surname did not choose the starting point. They did choose the next step. That choice is what this channel tracks. Not to judge from a comfortable distance, but to follow the evidence and to understand, as clearly as the documents allow, what actually happened inside these families after the uniforms were put away. There is always another file, another name in a search result. Another family sitting with a document they cannot put back in the box. We will continue to open those files carefully. We will continue to let the records speak and to sit with what they say. The next episode follows a different kind of inheritance. Not a name, but a photograph found in an attic in 1989, still in its original frame. The person who found it had been told the man in the photograph died in the war. The man in the photograph was standing in a location that no ordinary soldier would have been. That photograph became, eventually, a file. That file was eventually opened. That story is next.
October 16th, 1941, Moscow. A woman named Vera stands on a platform at Kazan station. She is holding a suitcase and a child. The train she is waiting for has not arrived. Behind her, hundreds more people are pressing forward. On the streets outside, smoke is rising from government buildings. Not from bombs, from papers being burned. That is the detail that tells you everything about what Moscow felt like on that day. The question this episode will answer is not whether Moscow survived. We know it did. The question is how a city and a command system came within hours of psychological collapse before a single German soldier entered it. And what kind of man was sent to hold it together when orders alone were no longer enough? Let us start with the map, because that is where the crisis began. By the first week of October 1941, the Wehrmacht had launched Operation Typhoon, the drive toward Moscow. German Army Group Center had executed a pincer movement at Vyazma and Bryansk that encircled Soviet forces on a catastrophic scale. The numbers that emerged from those encirclements remain staggering. Soviet losses in those two pockets alone ran into the hundreds of thousands of men, along with armor, artillery, and command structure. The roads leading east toward Moscow were, for a period, almost completely open. The Stavka, the Soviet High Command in Moscow, was receiving reports that were contradictory, incomplete, and sometimes simply wrong. Front commanders had lost communication with their own units. In some sectors, Soviet defensive positions that were supposed to be holding had already ceased to exist by the time orders reached them. The command picture was, in the bluntest terms, broken. Stalin received these reports in the Kremlin. What exactly he said and did during those days has been debated by historians for decades. What the records do confirm is that preparations were made for a potential Soviet government evacuation to Kuibyshev, roughly 850 kilometers to the southeast. Key ministries were ordered to begin relocating. The diplomatic corps left. Factories and their workers were being shipped east as part of an industrial evacuation that had actually been underway since the summer, but which now accelerated with new urgency, and word of all this leaked into the streets of Moscow.